We're live, but okay. Screen was black for me, so it didn't look like I had anything going on yet. So, wanted to just confirm. All right. Matthew McConaughey here. Okay, so there's some news that, well, I mean, I guess there's news. The news is just that, I'm continuing to do what I am doing. I did a couple of email blasts to some people to promote the podcast. I'm not really trying really hard to promote the podcast, and that's mostly because, I don't know, as a professor, I just have my own ethical questions about having my own podcast and whether or not I can monetize it or not. But the YouTube channel's not monetized. But there's that. Oh, that's what I wanted to talk about. Today is Tri-C Day, which is Cuyahoga Community College, which is where I work, which is where I teach. And because it's Tri-C Day, in the description for today's podcast, I am putting a link to the Tri-C Foundation. So if you want to donate, that would be fantastic. Donations to the Tri-C Foundation support scholarship funds that help support community college students who are in need of financial aid to go to college. So please consider donating to the Tri-C Fund if you are not already going to be donating. So I just wanted to put that in the news since today is Tri-C Day. I might as well do a shout out for the Tri-C Foundation. Consider donating. It'll help out someone who's going to college and maybe help them pay for a class that they're taking with me. I don't know. And if not, then you can just keep tuning into the podcast. And you can show your support that way. Or, show your support in other ways, I suppose, by buying Tri-C swag and stuff from their bookstore and whatnot. But that's basically it for the news for this week. Every week's not going to have astounding news related to the podcast or what we're working on. Oh, I will say the news unrelated to the podcast. I guess I could have a news segment that's news updating about from the archives, the podcast, and then news about generally what I'm doing, in classes and research and whatnot. We have all of our ducks in a row for the field school this summer, the Archaeological Field Methods, Anthropology 2030. So I hope to do some live streaming over this summer. Every Friday we'll be in the field. So, every Friday I'll probably do a little bit of a live stream showing off what we're doing in the field, what we're finding, maybe some lab days. I'll talk about stuff that we're, cleaning up and cataloging and all that kind of stuff. I also have a couple other field sites lined up for other smaller projects that I'll probably do some live streaming or some edited videos for. And what else we got going on? A few grants that are, fingers crossed in the works. We'll see how those go. If they get funded, then obviously I'll probably talk a little bit about them on the channel and maybe do some edited videos, maybe incorporate them into live streams as I see their relevancy or I see them fit. But otherwise, that's the news for this week. And that being said, let's get into the part that gets edited and recorded and all that kind of fun stuff. So for those of you who are tuning in and are not familiar with the format, basically the first 5 minutes of the live stream, I kind of, let people trickle in, but also, give news and updates about what's going on with anthropology at Tri-C, any projects that we're working on, and the podcast in general. So with all that out of the way, we then transition to, scripted segments and the actual what we're talking about this week in the podcast, because I edit these from the live stream. The live stream is meant to offer people the opportunity to engage with me live with whatever we're talking about. And then, I edit that into the podcast. There's a theme song and all that kind of good stuff. And then that gets released out into the world on Spotify, Google Podcasts, and all the other places you can get podcasts. I don't know. I mostly just use Spotify. But wherever you get them, they should be circulating via Anchor FM. So with that said, let's get rocking and a-rolling. Let me make sure I have everything ready and set up. All right, we're good. I have a bunch of tabs for today because there's a lot we could talk about with Disney corporate culture books. So get a little sip of tea in here. And we're off to the races. Hey there, bibliophiles. Welcome to another episode of From the Archives, a book review podcast where I talk about a book from my library. I'm Eric Olson, a professor of anthropology at Cuyahoga Community College, and welcome to my library. The books in my library are sometimes old, sometimes rare, sometimes normal, but always interesting. This podcast is recorded live at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time at Anthropology Archives on YouTube every Thursday. I believe I said that twice. I don't know. Can you tell I don't always script the intro? Every week I ask myself the following questions. Who read it? What's it about? What are other people saying about the book? And should I can it or keep it, shelve it or shove it, jettison or set it in? And I believe there's one other one that I had that I don't remember. Chuck it or cherish it. Basically, should I keep it on my bookshelf at home, or should I get rid of it? And should you read it? So without further ado, let's take a book from the shelf. And this week, we've got two books that we're talking about. That one was probably a little bit loud. But we've got two books that we're talking about today, and they are, and I'm going to try and line them up for those who are watching the live stream so they can see the covers. We've got The Mouse That Roared by Henry Giroux. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, from 1999. And then we've also got Lessons from the Mouse. So, obviously when we're talking about Disney, you got to use mouse in the title. Lessons from the Mouse by Dennis Snow. His name is hard to see on that cover, but, Dennis Snow's book is, let's see here, definitely less than 150 pages. Very short read. I was actually able to read this book in essentially an evening. Although I probably could have read it a lot faster if I wasn't such a professor and writing notes in the margins, because I pretty much do that with any book that I'm reading critically, unless I'm reading fiction and I don't feel like taking notes. So there's a little insider scoop for you. At least every professor I've worked with or talked to, a lot of them, generally speaking, when they're reading something, they read a lot slower than other people might read. Like my wife, Kristen, she'll read a book and she'll just, read it very fast. Whereas I feel the need to read things a lot slower to digest them in a slightly different manner. That's not saying reading fast is, I'm not trying to evaluate reading fast versus reading slow or how you approach your reading style. I'm just giving you context for this book. If you don't read it like you're a professor, you could easily read this like in an evening. Lessons from the Mouse, that is. Whereas The Mouse That Roared definitely took me a bit longer. Even if I wasn't reading it like an academic, it would still take me a bit longer to read, and that's just because of the density of the writing style. And though it is less than 200 pages, it's written like a academic book, so it's going to read a little bit differently than, say, The Great Gatsby. So a little context about these books. I decided to read these books in tandem, and the reasoning behind that was, well, first I wanted to read The Mouse That Roared because it looked like an ethnography or something about Disney, and so I was like, I should probably read a Disney book. It's on the bookshelf, and it ended up being a book about basically pedagogy and education, because Henry Giroux is, what is he now? I have it pulled up here. He is currently working at McMaster University in Ontario, but he used to work at Penn State for the Graduate School of Education. He has a PhD in education. So obviously this is based from a perspective of an educator, someone who teaches. He also taught for a few years at a high school in, I believe it was Rhode Island or Massachusetts. So very much coming from the perspective of an educator, writing about Disney and how they are used as a form of education, cultural education. This book was written in 1999. To give you a little description of the cover of this book, technically there's a subtitle. It's called Disney and the End of Innocence, and the cover is a bit like Lolita, which Kristen and I talked about before the podcast recording today. And it's got this picture of a young, what looks like girl with like cherry red lipstick, and she's kind of like, her eyes are closed and her lips look like they're, I don't know. I don't know how to take this cover. It seems kind of suggestive and sensual, and I'm just not a fan of the cover, for, at least compared to what the book has within it. It seems sort of like a disconnect between the two. Although, I'm sure Giroux would disagree with the choice of cover. And then Lessons from the Mouse very much looks like, a mid-2000s. I don't know if I said when this was published, 2010. This has just like a chalkboard and then Mickey Mouse's hand pointing to lessons from the mouse with a ruler. Yeah, the cover looks sort of clip arty, if you will. It's published by Dennis Snow's publishing company. Dennis Snow, by comparison to, very academic Henry Giroux, Dennis Snow worked at Disney for like 20 years, and then he went into business consulting. Basically, he goes on tour giving seminars about how to be a good, employer and how to improve your business quality and all that kind of stuff. Motivational speaking kind of stuff, which I'll get into later. But I wanted to read both of these books in parallel because I felt like they were both talking about Disney corporate culture, and they were talking about it on two opposite sides of the coin. So obviously Giroux is very critical of Disney corporate culture. Let's see, can I actually squeeze both of these into the camera without them falling off? I don't think so. Well, there you have it. We'll just do, I guess, something like that. I don't know. Can't get them to squeeze into the camera, so I'll just have one up. See, this is the kind of stuff when you're watching the live stream, you get to appreciate. But when you're listening to the podcast, this probably will get edited out. All of that little, rustling around with the books. I don't know. We'll see. But yeah, they're both sort of opposite sides of the coin here. Obviously, Dennis Snow is not going to have a bad thing to say about Disney, whereas Giroux has nothing pretty much good to say about Disney. And, I've already kind of given you context about the two. So one is obviously business background. The other one is education background. And I decided to look them up and give you some samples of what they sound like, since I realized when talking about these books, it's sometimes nice to have a little bit more perspective about the authors themselves. So I pulled a couple clips here, or rather just two clips, one for Snow and one for Giroux. And I want to start with the one from Giroux, and you kind of basically you can sort of get the sense of how the book might sound just based on how these people talk. At least I think so. So here's a short clip of Giroux, and this is an interview with Professor Henry Giroux, December 22nd, 2020. So this is a very recent interview, and it's done by EduKitchen, YouTube channel, and it was a Zoom Zoom lecture, I guess you could say. Sorry, doing too many things at once there. So without further ado, here we go.
I think in my teaching, it's very difficult because teaching has always been plagued by a kind of instrumental rationality, and I think that what the COVID crisis has done is really pushed in a remarkable way the discourse back about 50 years, because it seems to me that all we can talk about now are methods, Zoom, Team. The technology has overridden in many ways the most important assumptions about democracy, and that is, about education, and that is, how does education function to enhance the public good? How does it function to create citizens who are critical, self-reflective, compassionate, responsible? Those questions have become somewhat subordinate to more technical, instrumental questions.
Exactly. In fact...
All right, we're going to pause it there. So I also forgot, halfway through that, for the people watching the live stream, I forgot to throw up the image of him in that interview. And very much Henry Giroux gives off this Beatles vibe. He's wearing like the round glasses, black rimmed glasses, has sort of the bob haircut, coming down to just above the shoulders and down below the ears. Definitely not something in his book you would be allowed to have at Disney, because that could get you fired. But yeah, he definitely gives off strong, like, Paul McCartney vibes, at least just from physical appearances. But that sort of gives you an idea of, this is how he talks in lessons and lectures and interviews. That's kind of the writing style as well. At least you can glean from it. And now let's contrast that with Dennis Snow. And this is straight from his website, SnowAssociates.com. And this is his demo video about him being a public speaker.
Everyone on the team recognizing that everything speaks, and everyone on the team creating those moments of wow.
Has anybody been on this ride? The Tower of Terror. It's a pretty amazing ride. If you have not, what it is, it's this haunted hotel theme. And you go inside and you sit down in these special seats in these elevators, and it takes you 13 stories up to the top. And when you get to the top, the elevator starts to shake, and it feels like it's breaking. And why people want to do this, I have no idea. I think that's the weirdest thing.
So I could let it keep rolling, but basically this demo video is just compilations of the same speech that he gives over and over again at different places. And definitely you can hear the music in the background. Here, I guess headphones are coming off now. You can hear the music in the background. You can, see just from the editing style, it's very much a different approach to, your typical professor, where it might just be sitting in front of something and talking, not unlike what I'm doing now. But, oh no, where did I go here? Okay. But yeah, I think the two are very different sides of interpreting what we would call corporate culture. And really, this is a nebulous term, corporate culture. At least in both books, they mention the term corporate culture, and they have two very different understandings of it. Corporate culture, according to Dennis Snow, is very much, and I guess this is where we get into the segment of what's it about. Corporate culture is basically, how do you create an environment where employees want to do good, and how do you make an efficient work environment? It's told very much from a perspective of, as an employer, how do you create employees who are loyal, who do a good job? But from Giroux's perspective, corporate culture is very much the sense of how do you create hegemonic forces, or hegemony, to use like a big academic term from Antonio Gramsci back in the 1930s. Whoa, as my camera gets moved. But how do you create these cultural forces, this ideology that reinforces particular viewpoints about the world, about what we expect normative values to be, what does it mean to be white middle class in America, and how does Disney construct white middle class culture through their theme parks, through their business, through how they hire employees, their rigid control over employee behavior. He gives one example of an employee who forgot to cut their hair for a week, and then their hair touched their ears, and then they were just escorted off the premises and fired right then and there. And it was a big to-do about it. But Dennis would have you know, or he would argue, I doubt, I believe, I think, a lot of those kinds of words throughout Dennis Snow's perspective. I don't think this person got fired for such behavior. It's very sanitized in that sense. It felt very much like the leadership stuff that they're talking about in Dennis Snow's book kind of glosses over the potential complications of Disney's rigid corporate culture, and just basically talked about the benefits of applying these methods to, I guess I forgot I still had Dennis up there. Applying these methods without the implications of, well, if they don't comply, how do you get them to comply? Well, you create an ideology, which is what Giroux is critiquing. That ideology has a lot of externalities or issues with it that reinforce potentially bad gender and race stereotypes, class stereotypes. By sanitizing history, you're kind of erasing the complexities of history and interpreting that nuance. But in Dennis Snow's realm, that's not really the focus. Obviously, it's more about employee culture and leadership. As the subtitle says, a guide for applying Disney World secrets of success to your organization, your career, and your life. So I guess I need to transition now into talking about my thoughts on it, or at least, my reviews for both of these books. And honestly, I probably have to give both of these a 2 out of 5 stars. I can't give them really any lower, but I can't give them any higher. And I think that mostly has to do with delivery, to be perfectly honest. It's not that I think that the leadership strategies or goals that Dennis Snow outlines are terrible. It just came off very much as a, like I was reading a book written by a cult leader. I mean, here, I'll give you a little snippet of what I put together, or at least what I think I'm going to put together for the Goodreads review. Because I always post a Goodreads review about these and then, link to the podcast episode where we talk about it. But shockingly, a professor of anthropology who teaches about Marxist critiques isn't a big fan of a book about corporate culture and how beneficial it is. I definitely got the vibes from Dennis Snow's book of, your personal opinions, your personal beliefs, your personality, and your rights as a worker were backseated. Basically, in trying to explain what the exemplar worker was, I mean, I had problems when his idea of a heroic or ideal employee is willing to drive from Tampa to Orlando to return a laptop, or to take a stranger's clothes home and wash them in their home washing machine and dryer. When that's what you expect the bar to be set at, or what the ideal is, I think that's an issue of boundaries. And especially in a time of COVID where boundaries have been blurred, I really think it promotes it. Honestly, it can easily promote a toxic work environment or a rigid structure like Giroux is critiquing, where if you don't cut your hair, to a certain length, Disney will fire you. And I think what's lacking in the Dennis Snow book is any commentary on discipline and punishment. So he's very much trying to promote we need to create a culture of compliance, and we need to create a corporate culture that promotes selfless and self-sacrificial employees who don't whine or that's not my job. I mean, literally one of the things that says, never say that's not my job, don't even think it. It basically is reinforcing the idea that you shouldn't have boundaries as an employee. You shouldn't have a work-life balance. You should give yourself over to the job. I mean, obviously Dennis Snow isn't trying to overemphasize that, but I think that's the danger of reading a book like this uncritically and not taking it with a grain of salt. Is it definitely promotes this work culture of, you have to put on a smile, fake it till you make it. If you're miserable, and then it sends mixed messages of he at one point says you should be blessed to have a job. So when he's saying, even if the job is miserable at the moment, find ways to make it fun. So what does someone who enjoys their job do? So faking it. And then also trying to reinforce the idea of have perspective, just be blessed that you have a job. And then in the immediate next chapter says, if you don't like your job, find a new one. And being written in 2010, it seems sort of tone deaf to be well, if you don't like your job, find a new one. Or, due to circumstances, shouldn't you just everyone should be able to find a career that fulfills them and makes them happy. And I think it really, what I found the connect between the two is Giroux spent a lot of time critiquing Disney for sanitizing history and reality. Basically, he's arguing that the Disney model is to create a fantasy world, and you can't have reality slip in at all. Basically, if Disney could, they would control the weather. And wouldn't you know it, when I read Dennis Snow's book, he literally said one of the There Are No Stupid Questions segment. He has a chapter called There Are No Stupid Questions. And I know I'm talking a lot about the book here, so if you wanted to read them, then, you're not getting everything. Hopefully I'm not spoiling everything for you. Granted, I did give them 2 out of 5, so I'm not necessarily saying you should go out and read these books, essentially. But Dennis Snow literally has a comment about, can you turn the rain off? And I think that really it gets home the sentiment of, Dennis Snow is trying to create a fantasy where don't let reality slip in. Don't let the reality of capitalism slip in, that you are paid for your labor. And we don't want you to, hate your job or realize that, if you weren't getting paid, you would walk. He's trying to say, well, we want to create a world where people don't feel feel motivated to do their job because they feel like they're part of ownership. And it just felt like it was disingenuous cult leader BS of oh yeah, join my cult. I'm not grifting you or gaining everything from exploiting your labor. And he uses examples of basically in all the examples that he gives. And I know I'm really ripping on this one, but I'm going to rip on the Giroux book as well. Basically, all of his examples, instead of proposing alternatives of well, maybe pay your employees better, or I don't know, give them better breaks. He literally at one point says, don't take breaks. I mean, again, boundaries. Setting boundaries and healthy work habits for your employees are not a concern to Dennis Snow. You should just create a corporate culture where they don't even realize that they've basically given up their life to this job. At least if you take it to the logical extreme, that's basically what Dennis Snow is arguing. And so obviously I can't in good conscience say that this book is something I would super recommend. And if you are into it, just keep that in mind. And obviously, anthropology professor, not super enthused about a book about corporate culture and business practices. Shocking, I know. You're not going to see me reading a book about business and say like, oh, I'm a big fan. Despite the fact that we just talked about a book, Stone Age Economics, last week? But yeah, those are my thoughts on Lessons from the Mouse. As for Giroux, now, I don't really disagree with his critique. And to be clear, I even teach Marxist critiques of capitalism in my Intro to Anthropology classes. So it's not even a case of I'm unfamiliar with the literature or I have a stance that runs counter to Giroux. I just felt like Giroux's book, I couldn't quite get a good read on the audience. If you're familiar with the Frankfurt School, which is really where he gets a lot of his theoretical underpinnings, if you're familiar with the Frankfurt School, which is mid 20th century German Marxist school or social science school that was really critical of the culture industry or cultural critiques at the time and has been applied since. If you're familiar with that, then you probably don't need to read Giroux's book because you have knowledge of the theory. You already know your stance on Disney. It's not like, knowing about the Frankfurt School and Marxist critiques of capitalism, you're not going to all of a sudden be ignorant to Disney's corporate practices or how corporations try to manipulate mass media to benefit, their consumer base so that they can sustain profits. I mean, this is not new information for someone who's reading that. So for academics, myself included, I wasn't really getting anything new out of Giroux's book, except for maybe some anecdotes that I might remember. Like, again, the ones that stick out to me are the guy who got fired for his hair not being cut to the proper length. Literally, it touched his ears, so he had to be fired. Like, I mean, come on. That's extreme. But beyond those examples, and I would say there's a chapter on Celebration, the town that Disney, founded. And it gave off, this vibe of Little Boxes, the song by, oh gosh, who wrote that song? Little Boxes. Some lady back in the 60s or 70s. Malvina Reynolds. It definitely gave me the vibe of that song. Little boxes on the hillside. Little boxes made of ticky-tacky. Basically, creating a town that's just very bland, generic, sanitized. Nothing bad happens in this town. It's very neutral, but it's also white and middle class. So he has very good and pointed critiques. But I think the issue is people like myself and other academics already are familiar enough with this knowledge that when we read it, we already knew most of this stuff. So we're not really gaining anything new out of it. And the audience that does need this critique is definitely not reading this book. If you need someone to critique Disney for you, you are not going to be getting it from Giroux's book. I mean, it's the Frankfurt School is basically the school of buzzkills. To illustrate the point, he talks often about Adorno and Horkheimer, which are two theorists from the Frankfurt School. And I have found a good blog post that I'm going to include in the description that kind of encapsulates. I had to read this chapter from their book, The Dialectics of Enlightenment. The chapter is called The Culture Industry. And what stuck with me was just their perspective on laughter. And so this gives you an idea of the theoretical underpinnings of Giroux's book. I'm just going to read you a paragraph from this blog by Menahem Führer. I think I pronounced that right, or Führer? Feuer, I apologize. Written January 18th, 2015. So just this paragraph, I think, kind of succinctly wraps up Adorno and Horkheimer's perspective, at least in laughter. They go on to tell us that, really, there is no reason why anyone in the Western world should laugh. There is laughter because there is nothing to laugh at. In fact, laughter only happens when some fear passes. For them, laughter will always be in the wake of what is most. It is an escape or liberation from either physical danger or from the grip of logic. Laughter, in other words, also indicates an inability to face the world and to think in a serious manner. It is a vacation from the world and its problems. So when that is the theoretical school of thought that you are drawing from for your culture critique, like I said, I understand where it's coming from, but the approach and the delivery is not how you're going to win over people. You are not going to win over people by referencing Adorno and Horkheimer. I mean, sure, academics will talk about it and debate it, but your average Joe who is, thinking, I don't know if I'm a big fan of Disney's, corporate practices and behaviors. Like, I think they could do better. Someone who's on the fence or anything like that, they're not going to read Giroux and be like, oh, like I'm converted. So yeah, I just think it was a mismatch of message with delivery. The people who need to read this or should have this critique in their repertoire of knowledge are not going to read it because they're going to be turned off from it. And the people who already know about this critique aren't really gaining anything that they didn't already know from this culture critique. So that's my main criticisms and why I would have to give both of them a 2 out of 5. But if I gave it a 2 out of 5, what are other people saying about it? So I have pulled a couple of reviews, one for The Mouse That Roared and one for Lessons from the Mouse. And both of them are 5 stars because obviously if I gave it a bad review, I'm going to read a good review, and vice versa. If I gave it a good review, I'm going to read a bad review, just to give you a little bit of perspective here. And I think what's telling about The Mouse That Roared is that the 5-star reviews read like they're written by professors and academics. They're really lengthy. They're really like, oh yeah, like this really, you got 'em. It's gotcha Disney. As if this is something groundbreaking or earth-shattering. Like, yeah, we know Disney does some sketchy things and bad things. It's sort of like in 2021, we all know Nestle is an unsavory corporation that steals water rights from people. Like, it's at least in a lot of circles, I would say. And certainly in 2021, there's so much information out there on social media posts, YouTube channels of people who have been critical of Disney that you can certainly get access to the culture critique of Disney pretty much anywhere at this point. And Giroux, just how do you compete with that? So in 2021, I don't see any utility in reading Giroux still. But Jeffrey Margolis on April 5th, 2021, so very recently, within the last 2 weeks, had this to say about The Mouse That Roared. Most families don't think about the reach of the Disney organization beyond trying to figure out how to afford a trip to Disney World without breaking the bank. Sorry, bear with me here. But former Penn State Graduate School professor Henry Giroux invites the reader to dig deeper. The Disney Company is one of the country's largest publisher of children's books and is the owner of the ABC television network. At one time, the company owned 2 major professional sports teams and is currently the owner of a cruise line. Its position places the company in the unique position of having a say as to what constitutes middle-class values. Disney Company went so far as to create and build a town, Celebration, Florida, that espouses these values. Giroux writes, "Celebration is a reaffirmation of the current assumption that only a corporate-driven culture can address the problems of the city with creativity and efficiency." The author also points out how children have been manipulated by the Disney mystique. Originally written in 1999, The Mouse That Roars is still quite relevant today. Yeah, I would say it is relevant, but in terms of who should read it and how you should read it, I just don't see an audience for it. I mean, it's like I said, the critique itself is not the issue. It's the delivery of it. I just, it comes off as this big buzzkill that, even someone who agrees with Giroux on most of it all, the writing style just didn't do it for me. And just to scroll up here to give you an example of why I said the 5-star reviews seem to be academic, Trevor on September 29th, 2014. First off, I just love that he shelved this under children's literature. I mean, if you've got a child reading Henry Giroux, like, do they also wear a bow tie and an Oxford shirt and attend community college on the side? I mean, this is not a children's book. I mean, it's about children's literature and children's media, but I wouldn't call it a children's book. I mean, Trevor wrote 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 paragraphs. I mean, this thing's got to be like 1,000 words on this book, and it's a 5-star review. And I guess that's the point I'm making. It's sort of you're preaching to the choir to the people who already know most of the critiques that you're going to lay out, and the people who need to hear it aren't going to listen. So it just seems sort of like why read the book if you already have the knowledge of the critique and you can get it elsewhere, I guess is basically my point that I'm making. Now let's head on over to The Mouse That Roared, the opposite side of the coin. I've got a 5-star review here from November 5th, 2020. by Mila O'Brien. She rated it 5 stars, obviously. Easy to read, short, and to the point. I love learning through analogy, or in this case, examples. Lots of good, solid business principles consistent with leaders in customer service, marketing, and sales. Great insights without talking down to you or adding too much MBA speak or even, quote, Covey Otis. I did some searching online and I could not figure out what Covey Otis was. I suspect that might be an MBA speak term that I don't know. But, a lot of the 5-star reviews are just compare. Look at the 5-star reviews of Dennis Snow's book versus the 5-star reviews of Henry Giroux, and you can see the stark contrast. Other than this one by Jim Bouchard from December 8th, 2010, that has 5 paragraphs, but probably a third of the text of that other review for Henry Giroux. Most of these reviews are short and succinct, basically saying, hey, it really helped me in my business practices or my corporate culture, yada, yada, yada. Not really critical reviews discussing the book. Also, I should mention that Dennis Snow's Lessons from the Mouse has an average rating of 4.02 stars out of 332 ratings, 34 written reviews. Meanwhile, The Mouse That Roared has 336 reviews, 37 of those written, and has an average rating of 3.57. So, obviously Dennis Snow's book is slightly better off reviews-wise than Henry Giroux's. So my final thoughts on these are, at least in terms of the book bin, because we have to discuss should I keep it on my bookshelf or not. Henry Giroux's book, I'm going to say... sorry, I thought the stream had paused there for a second. Henry Giroux's book, I'm going to can it. I'm going to put this in the book bin, mostly because, like I said, I read this book and did not glean too much that I didn't already have as someone who has read Adorno and Horkheimer, someone who has read many a Marxist critique of corporate culture. This doesn't really add anything that I didn't already know in advance. But certainly if this is something that interests you, understanding how hegemony works, understanding how ideologies get propagated through corporate culture, basically how corporations can manipulate discourse. So, he doesn't really get too into the weeds with, it's all based on Adorno and Horkheimer and Michel Foucault and Antonio Gramsci. It's all based on these theoreticians, I guess you could say, or philosophers, social scientists, but he doesn't really get too into the weeds of he's not spending a whole chapter on Gramsci, he's not spending a whole chapter on Foucault, but definitely I think it's a more approachable way of interpreting this stuff. So if you're say an undergraduate student, someone who's just dipping their toes into it, it's a good introduction. So at least in that regards, I would probably say it's not bad. But if you are someone who has a bachelor's degree in anthropology, you've taken anthropological theory, you've already taken, social science courses that get you thinking about this stuff, or taken a class on Marx or any of that kind of stuff, then this isn't the book for you. You probably already know most of the stuff that Giroux is critiquing. And as for Lessons from the Mouse, this is technically Kristen's book, not my own. So I cannot put this in the book bin, but you can believe it, if I had control over it, this thing would be in the book bin. But yeah, that's my 2 cents on Lessons from the Mouse. Can't get rid of that one because it's technically Kristen's book, not mine. But The Mouse That Roared, if you want it, reach out to me on my email at anthropologyarchives@gmail.com. If you want a full list of the book bin, you can check it out on our Google Sheet, which has all of the books that have been reviewed, what the ratings were that I gave them, whether or not they're in the book bin, or if I kept them, or if I kept the artwork. Basically, if it's in the book bin, it's up for grabs. And you can send me an email with your questions, comments, or requests for books that are in the book bin at the email aforementioned. Also, check us out on Telegram, us, using the royal we there. Check me out on Telegram to find out what I'm doing in the field or with the podcast, upcoming news, and that kind of stuff. There's a Telegram channel that's linked in the YouTube. The YouTube channel has it, and it should also be on the anchor.fm channel as well. And that's going to do it for this week. Next week, we are going to be reading atlases and talking about why I have atlases and why I think you should keep an atlas on your shelf, at least one of them. Whether or not you keep any of the atlases I have is a larger question and discussion, but that's going to be next week's topic. And until then, never stop reading.